Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Zian Leitz. She is a science communicator, the author of The Ultimate Guide to Green Parenting and Only a Moment, founder of Emergency Reactor, former editor of The Hourglass newspaper, and former spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Extinction Rebellion, climate change, clean energy, ethical parenting. So, Zian, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So tell us first about Extinction Rebellion. So how did you get involved with them? And perhaps, I mean, tell us a little bit about that bit of your story, and then we might get a little bit into why you left the organization and what are your general thoughts about it.
Well, I was involved in quite a lot of different environmental groups from quite a young age, because I really cared about, deforestation and climate change and all these different issues. But I became very disillusioned with them, particularly because I felt that they were putting feelings before facts in a lot of instances. And yeah, I ended up leaving numerous different groups actually and just sort of going my own way. So when Extinction Rebellion was founded here in Britain, initially I ignored them. I thought it's just going to be the same old thing. I'm done doing this. I was doing this 10 years ago, but they were very popular here. They're very successful. Initially they had really good media coverage. They had a lot of journalists on side. Their messaging was okay. I was listening to what they were saying. It was quite positive actually at the beginning, the movement. So I went to my local group, my local chapter, to see what it was like. And to be honest, I felt that it wasn't for me. So I kind of turned up, had a look, and it was a huge meeting. There were like 100 people there, at least, really interested in how they could get involved. And at that point, they were doing a lot more fun actions. It wasn't all blocking roads. They were quite creative. There was a lot of art. I thought it was quite a positive movement. But I still sort of backed away. And then I got, people had seen that I'd turned up and they put me in touch with the founders, basically kind of the core organizational group, not just a local chapter. And they said, look, we've seen your TED talk on stargazing. Would you be a spokesperson for us? And I kind of said, well, I've just been just sort of stepped away, actually. Don't think it's for me. And they said, well, we need someone who can do the communication and you'll have big TV slots. And I thought, well, if I don't do it, they'll just have someone that doesn't represent the science doing it. So I agreed to do it on that basis. I did go down and join the Waterloo blockade, where they blocked 4 or 5 different main roads in London. I went down to have a look at that, and again, it was very positive movement. There was a lot of good energy on the streets. There was a lot of public support, which changed later. So on to the reasons for leaving. I basically watched them kind of spiral into a sort of doom spiral, a very negative, apocalyptic view of the world. I would say that's not how they started out. But I think those founders who had those opinions were pushing those views more and more, and some of them were spokespeople. So I was then put in a difficult position of having to discuss things like the end of the world, which I didn't want to have to. And I would say, on TV, I would say, wow, that's not true, and maybe we shouldn't have said that. But it increasingly became apparent that my values didn't align with the values of this group. So after about a year of doing the kind of TV slots, I felt that I should distance myself. And actually, it was right after they did a train action where they stood on several different trains in Britain, in the underground, actually, on the tube. And some people were injured. They were pulled off the trains, and that was kind of where I went. This is, and when I spoke to some of these people about that action. They said they really had fallen for this idea that it doesn't matter if we get attacked. It doesn't matter if we fall off the trains. It doesn't matter if people are late for work or lose their jobs. Climate change is that big a deal. And that's where I felt that they'd gone from being quite evidence-based to quite cultish. And I think this can happen with any large group, actually. I think sometimes they move so quickly, people's common sense doesn't catch up with their feelings. So anyway, so I left because my values didn't align with them anymore.
But what do you mean when you say that over time they developed a sort of apocalyptic view of the world? What does that mean
So
exactly?
honestly, in the beginning, it was so positive, that we had good press coverage, groups was sprung up all around the world, and I felt like finally we can talk about climate change in a sensible way. We can talk about solutions. I wanted to talk about things like nuclear power, um, which I couldn't do actually. But yeah, I just noticed that, for example, there was a youth wing. There's a very active youth wing of Extinction Rebellion. A lot of young people who are concerned about climate. Now, for me, um, I would like to see those people have a really positive future, the best future we can give them. And so I would talk to them about, what are the solutions? How do we implement them? But they were very much being fed a different storyline by one of the founders, actually, I would say, and his followers, who would say, your future's been taken away from you. The world will end in 12 years. Um, this is the fault of the current generation, um, um, and they've let you down, and they should be punished even. And it's quite extreme. I thought it was quite extreme, but when I was speaking to the younger group, I saw, yeah, increasingly that they just became unreachable. I started out having really good positive conversations, and then the next time I saw them, they're ranting about this is all your fault, and we're going to take you down, and blah blah. It was the Greta line as well, because Greta was saying at the same time, "You've taken my future," and I was thinking, you guys have one of the best, some of the best opportunities in the world. Actually, very very wealthy, live in a high income country. You have good education, you have healthcare. There's, if anything, you could be talking about solutions. And then they would say, well, that's climate denial. That's climate denial. That's not recognizing how bad the problem is. But then I would say, well, if it's that bad and we're doomed, why do anything? But there was no reaching them. There was no reaching them. And when I saw that spiral, and I mean, it really was quite extreme. There was a lot of people in those groups self-harming, for example. They
Mhm.
did an action in London. I think it was at Westminster. I can't remember where it was. I mean, they did multiple where they were naked, uh, or naked from the waist up. Some of them were fully naked, and there were photos that came in from one of those actions that they were sent around all of us before they go to press, and you could see just cuts on their arms. I thought this was really extreme, and they just the media team just selected the photos where you couldn't see the cuts, and I would say to some of the leaders, some of the older people in the group, and some of the founders, we shouldn't be encouraging this. These people need help. And they would say, no, they're having an appropriate reaction to the climate emergency, which I don't agree with, actually. I think that anxiety would exist whether or not climate change existed. That anxiety is a problem that a lot of young people are having. And if anything, there were people encouraging that in the groups. And the more I saw that kind of doom-ridden, narrative, um, and slide into more extreme actions like the train action really just upset a lot of people. We went from having a lot of support to just angering everybody.
Mhm.
Yeah, I realized that somehow the balance had shifted, and we weren't a positive group anymore that wanted to see good change in the world. We were just yeah, about apocalypse and doom, and to me, what's the point of anything? If you really believe that, what's the point of doing anything? Why go block a road? If you think the world will end tomorrow, what's the point? But I couldn't get through to people with that logic, so I left.
So when it comes to making people pay more attention to climate change, which of course is one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest global issue that we have to deal with at the moment and in the near future, I mean, I get, to some extent, I get why would some people get desperate and do those sorts of things that you described there to get people's attention. But since it usually has such a negative impact on people in general and what they think about these movements, these groups, these activists, what would you say are perhaps or would be better ways of trying to get a more positive result when it comes to really trying to drive home the message that people really do have to pay attention to
Well, I
climate
think the
change?
thing is that that work has been done, and that was something that Extinction Rebellion was good at the same time as kind of Fridays for the Future and Greta's work, which was making people aware. But that isn't enough. Most people don't have a magic button that they can push and fix a problem. All it's done is given them a lot of anxiety. I'm not saying they shouldn't be made aware, but I think when you talk to people about the problems, you should always also, you know, include solutions. I think that's really important. Otherwise, you're just, you know, putting a huge problem in someone's lap and then walking away. Did that help climate change? No, it didn't actually. You know, I think actually hyper focus on climate change is now a problem, and that we should be really hyper focusing on what are the solutions to emissions and to still issues like deforestation, which are a big problem. You know, and lots of other issues that have been pushed to the side because climate change has taken all the space. And now if you look at, if you want to do work in this area, it's all about climate. And you think, well, it is a really important issue, but there are also lots of other important issues in the world that are now being neglected, like, you know, basic sanitation in some low income countries, or access to certain technologies. And that, sadly, you know, what it means is that because of that focus, a lot of the funding is just in the climate space, and it's hard to get it now in other areas. And I have spoken to people of other groups, say, you know, minority groups, if you like, who've said all this money is being sucked up by this one cause. And you know, the problem that I see with it is that the cause is not focused on the solution. So you can keep banging the same message: fix it, fix it. We'll block a road if you don't fix it. But they refuse to talk about the things that actually could fix it. No one wants to talk about desalination, nuclear energy. I mean, all right, nuclear energy is much more popular now, but when I started out in this work a few years ago, I mean, I was really heavily attacked as an environmentalist for coming out and speaking about nuclear energy. It's really changed a lot. There was not a day that went by where I didn't get called a shill or hate mail. All of that stopped now, completely stopped. So it's changed a lot. Because actually, when you start talking about solutions, people are really keen. They want to hear, you know, what can we do? And in a way, the environmental movement has lied to people, you know, because they themselves have believed nonsense, which is that, oh, well, if you just, you know, turn off the tap while you're brushing your teeth, or make sure you turn off the light when you leave the room, all the problems will be fixed. Well, yeah, sure, we shouldn't waste resources. I'm not disagreeing, but I don't think anyone really would disagree with that. Most of us are turning off the lights because it costs us money if we don't. But frankly, we've been misled for decades, being told these are the solutions that will solve the problem. Well, actually, quite a lot of us are doing that. I wrote an entire book on how to do that before I kind of, frankly, just looked at the math and went, even if everybody does this, it is not going to really reduce our emissions significantly, and nowhere near how much they need to. We need a big solution, and that's clean energy. And that's where I think the problem is, where those groups have not kind of talked about that. And I've helped to talk about it, and lots of people are now doing that. But there are lots of other things that we should be talking about, like desalination in countries that are going to suffer from more water scarcity, although actually we're having problems here with that. You know, lots of different solutions that are out there. And I think if we can, you know, push the narrative into that, you know, take some of the funding away from talking about climate change and put it into fusion technology, for example. These are really big solutions that could change everybody's life kind of overnight, as many new technologies do. But instead, we're still just hyper focusing on what you do makes the biggest difference, you know, small incremental changes. And yeah, small changes can make a difference, you know, changing from a diesel car to an electric car, that does make some difference. That is an incremental improvement, and that's something that someone can do. But still, even if we all do that, that electricity comes from somewhere, comes from the grid, right? And in the UK, that's still 60% fossil fuels. So again, there's no kind of nuance in the debate. The slogans were very popular in Extinction Rebellion, and I helped to popularize them. But now I realize that, you know, they're problematic because they boiled things down, so they simplified them so much, when actually it's a really complex problem that involves many different areas that need to be addressed, but also many different communities around the world who don't get a say, who actually, you know, many of these people in low income countries are the people who will most be impacted by climate change. And we need to be looking at, what do they need? You know, do they need to build seawalls, for example? Do they need to help with flood risk, or better models for predicting weather, which, you know, that is happening. AI is helping with that. But is there money going into that in terms of climate initiatives? No, it's not. It's going into people just speaking about the same things again and again. If you look at the sheer number of panels and things that happen on this, and then people patting themselves on the back, yeah, we had a great awareness panel about climate change. Awareness isn't the problem. The awareness is there, but awareness is not going to do all that much. unless it reaches the right people who understand what the right solutions are. And I still speak with politicians in all over the world, not just here, who don't understand what solutions are because they're not very science literate, but mostly the messaging hasn't reached them. So they're just stuck at the stage of panic or kind of gone, well, let's ignore it because it's a big insurmountable problem. And it's not insurmountable. Actually, we have all the technology we need to fix it.
So I want to ask you more about the potential solutions with the focus on nuclear energy and also some other solutions that we usually hear from activists that perhaps have some limitations. But just before we get into that, as far as we know, according to the best climate science that we have and the best models, what would be some of the worst potential consequences of climate change for human society and the planet as a whole?
So the worst, the worst model, there's a lot that we don't know, but we know that we'll have more unpredictable weather, more extreme weather. We're seeing some of this in some parts of the world where there are, for example, more hurricanes, things like that. But it's very hard to actually tie them to climate change. All we can say is that these are now more common occurrences. Unpredictable weather is more now common. Heat waves are now more common. Periods of flooding in all around the world are more common. And that is what the models predicted. So we can say, we said this would happen, and now look, it's happening, even though a lot of people will say, well, you can't directly tie it. But actually, once we get more data, scientists will be able to start tying it and say, well, this is really out of sync with what we're used to. But certainly we can say with climate change, or as we used to call it, global warming, which I think is kind of the more accurate term, but I understand why it was changed, because then people expect only a fluctuation of heat. But anyway, we have seen that, we've seen that even in Britain, year on year, record highs. And yeah, occasionally there'll be a dip, but we're not measuring weather. We're measuring climate, which is a period of time, which is something a lot of people don't understand. So over a period of time, it is incrementally getting warmer, and that is tied to our activities. I'm not even saying that's about your or my daily activities, which I think is where the messaging has gone wrong from environmentalists, kind of pointing fingers, saying this was you. It is the entire lifestyle of the world, or at least the world that doesn't live in poverty. It is a consequence, and that is measured in multiple different ways. And that science is very solid. And if you know anything about scientists, there's a lot of arguments about scientific consensus, right? There's a lot of, that's what it is. They argue about the data, the really tiny pedantic bits of information until they can reach a consensus. Now, for a lot of science, it doesn't reach high numbers. Even some vaccines are 60% scientific consensus, but I'm not saying people shouldn't have vaccines. I'm completely pro vaccination, and that's something that I used to work on in comms. But with nuclear, with climate change, you've got the IPCC report, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's an independent body. Lots of scientists work on that, not just climate scientists, but all kinds of oceanographers, geologists, people looking at their fields, say what changes can we see, and how do these all map up together to show a whole of what's happening to the world. Planet is warming. It is being caused by humans. But the good news is the report that they put out in 2018, the 1.5 warming report, it also says we can fix this, and here's how. And the problem is that everybody's focused on the bit where they've said, guys, this could be really bad. And they're not saying it will be really bad. There's leeway, and they do use some of the worst modeling. So it might not be, but eventually, if the problem continues, it will still get to be that bad, right? So they're saying all of these problems will happen, but according to what the data tells us, but there's room for change. There's room to reduce some of those impacts. It basically comes down to reducing emissions. It's not that complicated, but it's not about just you and I turning off the lights. It's about where the power for those lights comes from, which is where the messaging has got lost, I think. And that's not all of it. Some of it is that we're talking about electricity there, and there's still, cars on the road and gas boilers and things. But actually, a lot of shifts are happening. In the UK, a lot of people are buying electric vehicles now. I think 1 in 10 vehicles now is an electric vehicle, and people are switching over to heat pumps and things like that. So I think the electrification will also happen, but ironically, a lot of environmentalists are against electrification because they think we should use less and not just have these kind of changes where we maintain the same lifestyles. But I don't think I don't think that that's the right approach. I don't think people will give up those lifestyles, and I don't think they should have to either. You know, I think people will always favor convenience. So what we need to do is make it convenient and cheap to have clean power. And that's where nuclear comes in, right? If all of the world, or at least the kind of developing world at the time, had decarbonized the way France did, 1980s, build 50 plus reactors over a period of about a decade, completely decarbonize their grid, and they built some renewables too. If everywhere had done that, we wouldn't have had that 1.5 warming report from scientists saying this is how bad it is. And the point I was making earlier about the consensus, that report has a 99% consensus. That's a huge amount. So yeah, you can find 1% of scientists who contribute to that report who will say, no, actually, I disagree. I think it's just, you know, solar flares or whatever arguments they have. And that's fine. You know, that's good actually, because if it was 100%, you might think, why is there no one disagreeing? Where's the dissent? This is how science works, right? You hash it out. But 99% consensus is a really high number. That, you know, it's like 99, you know, you have 100 engineers and 99 of them say, don't get in that car. Maybe not engineers, mechanics. Don't get in that car because, you know, it's got really high likelihood that it will crash if you get in it. And then 1% says no. One person says no, it's fine. I would, you know, maybe that one person's right in a really small, there's a really small chance that they are, but most people would listen to the 99. And I think it's really important to talk about the consensus because of that, but also to remember that same report has the same consensus for what the mitigation strategies are. And that's where nuclear power comes in actually. And that's, you know, not been implemented as quickly as it could have been. A lot of countries in the East are doing it, but in the West, we have, I think, fallen for environmental rhetoric for so long. We've made it difficult to build it here now, which is ridiculous because if you want to solve the problem, that's one of the biggest solutions that we have.
So just before we get into nuclear power, just for the audience to understand a little bit better some of these terms, I mean, because sometimes people use the term clean energy and it's a bit unclear in particular contexts and the way that sometimes people communicate about it, what that really means. So what types of energy sources fall under the rubric of a clean energy?
So yeah, you're right. It's complicated. I tend to go by the Our World in Data analysis, which, you know, anyone can go and look at on their website because it's very thorough the way they've thought about it. And they're looking at emissions, but they're also looking at things like land footprint. So you've got on the clean side, you've got solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear. Then under fossil fuels, you've got gas, coal, and actually, I would say that gas. I think actually, again, there's a problem with lumping them together as fossil fuels because gas is probably, you know, gas compared to coal. If you have to choose one, choose gas. It is much cleaner. It's not in the clean energy side, but for some countries where the choice is just gas or coal, they should absolutely have gas. So I think, again, this kind of Western rhetoric influencing other nations saying, oh, you shouldn't be burning any of these fuels is ridiculous. They are not able to leap ahead and have clean energy. But I do think there's a lot of confusion with people use clean synonymously with renewables. And I think that's a problem because renewables, technically, it's wind, solar, hydro, and biomass. And biomass is not clean and should not be included in that. But actually, if you look at countries' different kind of environmental targets around the world, they count biomass. So a lot of the time they'll say, hey, we have 60% renewable energy. When you look at the figures, 50% of it is biomass. That's really problematic. I mean, we have it here as well. And we count it as a climate solution and it gets funded and subsidies when actually, you know, it's very polluting. So it's not clean, but it's classed as renewable. So we shouldn't use renewables synonymously. Also, renewables are all created, you know, like fossil fuels. They're different. So hydropower is extremely reliable. So I like to talk about reliable clean energy, in which case you just narrow it down to nuclear and hydro. Hydro is great, right? But it's geographically dependent. Not everyone can have a lot of hydropower. It also has more risks than nuclear power, which a lot of people don't believe. And I'd urge them to go and look up the Bankyo Dam disaster or any dam disaster, really. And they'll say, oh, well, it doesn't, you know, displace people the way nuclear. Yes, it does. It completely flattens everything in its area, you know. And and has harmed a lot of people. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't build it. I just think it's interesting that people don't protest it. They don't tend to protest it the way they protested nuclear for a long time. Yeah, so the definitions I use are our world and data figures, because they've really crunched the numbers and come out with that. But also, it's in the IPCC report. They say to decarbonize, we need a combination of nuclear and renewables. There's no other way to do it. And that is actually, if you look at all the industrialized nations in the world that have been able to decarbonize, which reach over kind of 70 or 80% clean energy mix in their grid, they haven't been able to do it without a combination of nuclear and renewables. Even the countries that have a lot of hydropower, like Sweden, still use some nuclear, although they don't need as much as other countries.
So when it comes to nuclear energy specifically, what would you say are perhaps some of the most common myths and misconceptions? Because sometimes the way people talk about nuclear energy, it seems like a boogeyman or something like that. So.
I think it's changing a lot, but there are a lot of ingrained old ideas, which is, that it's not safe, which isn't true, that the waste is like really dangerous, which isn't true. I mean, technically, yes, the waste is dangerous, but so is medical waste. It's well managed is the main thing, and it's never killed anyone. Whereas, fossil fuel waste is being stored in the Earth's atmosphere. So yeah, those are probably the main ones. But now I think actually the conversation shifted. When I started out in this work a few years ago, those were the main arguments. Now people seem to have moved forward that, I think a lot of the information's out there. People have gone, okay, maybe we were wrong on those things. So they have different arguments now, which is it takes a long time to build and it's expensive. Now it can take a long time to build, absolutely. But the reason for that is because of regulations and other problems, not because of the technology. So if you look in South Korea, other parts in the East, United Arab Emirates, they're building them in, 4 or 5 years. New reactors can be built really quickly. Whereas I actually saw a study recently that said if we tried to build an APR 1000, which is a South Korean reactor, if we tried to build it here in the UK, it wouldn't even pass the basic planning regulations for about 7 years, because it is so strict. But the regulations are more strict than for building a coal-fired power station. That's how ridiculous it is. So these myths have had a real impact on real life. And so it's kind of a perpetuating cycle, because people say it takes too long to build, and then they protest it, and it takes even longer to build and that's happening here at Sizewell C, because the environmental groups are taking Sizewell to court saying your environmental standards aren't good enough. It's actually, the court has said that's not true, and but now it's gone to an appeal process, but it slows everything down. But mostly it costs a lot of money, so it becomes more expensive. It doesn't have to be expensive. So those are and they are myths, I would say. If you just look at it on a surface level, yeah, in the West, some of the countries in the West, in the UK, it is expensive to build them, and they do take a long time. But that's not inherent to the technology. So we need to really have some reform in the planning process there, and like re-regulate nuclear, as I like to say. Other myths, I mean, I've heard some ridiculous myths over the years. I think a lot of them have died a slow death, which is great. The funniest one I ever heard was that nuclear energy is sexist, because it's like a hard energy and men like it. I know, how ridiculous. But that, some people really believe that, and they'll say wind and solar are natural because it's the elements. Which I think is funny, because what's more natural than an atom, actually, if you want to use that logic? But anyway, it's not a logical argument, so we don't need to talk about it. But that's the funniest one I've ever heard.
Do you think that when it comes to nuclear energy, we should consider, and of course, I'm not sure if we would think about this as a limitation, and this is not a criticism of nuclear energy itself or nuclear power, but do you think that we should consider perhaps the availability of uranium or not?
Yeah, we should think about uranium, where we get the reserves from. A lot of them come from Kazakhstan. Canada has a lot. Australia has a lot. There's no immediate shortage. I always think it's a bit weird that the people who say it's going to run out, it's going to run out in whatever 4,000 years, are the same people who are saying there won't be a planet 4,000 years. I always think that's a strange thing. There won't be a habitable planet, because they think life will be extinct. But I've seen people crunch the numbers on this. What is nuclear is one of my go-tos. Nick Turan, who's crunch some of the numbers, and he said if we use breeder reactors, we've got 6 billion years worth of uranium. So it really, again, it depends on, it's not just about reserves, it's about how they're used. But I still think it's just, it's a silly argument. It's like the whole peak oil. Do you remember that? The peak oil, we're hitting peak oil. Did that happen, or did we find new reserves? In fact, we increasingly find better technologies for finding new reserves, or for using our resources better. Actually, we're really good at doing that. And with nuclear, you can recycle, right? Which very few countries do, which is unfortunate. But that's another thing that a little bit of uranium goes a long, long way. This is what I often tell people, and energy density is really important. So no, we're not going to run out of it anytime soon. But I would say that even if you did say, I've calculated the numbers, and I'm sure that without interventions, without finding more, we've got 1,000 years. I really hope that we have better energy, electricity generation sources in 1,000 years. I would hope that we have fusion. And I know that's a big hope, but I can't imagine that our progress would stall that much. I mean, I think there'd have to be a really big, significant event to stop. If you look at what we have now compared to 40 years ago, mobile phones, AI, internet, and then 40 years before that, it's really rapid change. We're in a real kind of technological era. I would expect there to be something better out there. And I think nuclear is great, don't get me wrong. But yeah, I think it's a silly argument.
And about renewable energy, because sometimes people, particularly activists, talk about the different kinds of renewable energy as a sort of a panacea, right? But what are the limitations here in terms of the extent to which we can or could rely on renewable sources of energy to tackle climate change?
So, I mean, people have different opinions on this. We're in the realm of opinion now. This is not representing solid data because there isn't any. It's very, it's completely variable because, for example, in Britain, this is not a good place to have a lot of solar farms. It is not a very sunny country. I mean, it's spring now and we're lucky if we get any sunshine. And that's consistent. But then at the same time, even in, some of the sunniest countries and in places like California where they built a lot of solar power, it's not helping much with the grid. And in the summer, it might, so all right, here's an example. It's really windy here at the moment, ridiculously windy, gale force winds, things blowing across the garden. And because of that, we suddenly got a huge surge in wind power. All the articles and the reporting are saying, look at this. Britain's got all this wind power. We're going to be powered by wind in the future. All these journalists are missing the point that it's not normally this windy. You can't store it for when it's not windy. Now, I know that sounds really ridiculously simple, but that is the stage of communication we're at with a lot of these people. So yeah, it's fine to have it. It's because at the moment it's powering the grid and we're using like 4% gas, which is really unusual for us. So it is good. But because the storage capability isn't there, it doesn't matter tomorrow or next week or for the rest of the year when it isn't very windy or isn't very sunny. And so what I'm trying to say is it's quite limited. It's not an abundant energy source. It's limited. Now, a lot of environmentalists know this and they will say, why can't we live with intermittent, occasional energy? And I know environmentalists who've said, I have panels on my roof and when I use what they supply and when they're not supplying, I don't use anything. And that's fine if they, don't mind that they miss their favorite TV program or whatever. But we need to be a bit more realistic that we need to keep, fridges running, right? We need to keep the lights working. If you need to, we don't want to go back to using candles at night because your panels, because you've run out of stored solar energy. So the issue really is that the storage isn't very good. Now, 15 years ago, I was a big advocate for wind and solar. And I would say, if we put more money into it, if countries actually invested in it, around the corner, we're going to have amazing battery storage. And I think it's really sad that people are making those same arguments today because the frank fact is that in 15 years, that hasn't happened. The storage has improved somewhat, but you're not going to change the basic fundamental laws of physics, right? That is as good as the storage is going to get. And actually, we now have a case study which is Germany. So Germany is a really good case study in answer to your question, which is how much kind of country we rely on this. All right, industrialized nation, very successful nation, high quality of life, they've done really good stuff at reducing emissions by insulating houses and EVs and like, you know, all the kind of measures that you can do on the ground. They've done that. And also people are very good at, you know, that taking shorter showers. So they've helped with the individual change, the behavioral change.
Yeah. Even
then, they built loads of wind turbines and solar panels. They built huge amounts. You know, they invested trillions in this. It's not small amounts of money, trillions of euros. Phased out their coal-fired power stations, phased out their nuclear power stations. What happened? I mean, everybody knows what happened by now, which is that your grid will fail. And they did actually have to tell people in certain regions that they had to ration how much, you know, how long they could be in the shower for, things like that, which I think actually just turns people against clean energy or climate action because they don't like that and it upsets their lives. But mainly it's a case study to show you can't do it with the entire grid. You just can't. Nowhere's been able to, and they really did try. They did put the money into it. They did have the best storage. They did set up all the poles and wires. They put all that money into it, and it's not cheaper than if they put that money into nuclear. It's just not. If they had put that money into nuclear, they'd have clean, reliable energy, and people wouldn't have to ration, and the grid would be clean. But now instead, they've had to reopen their mothballed coal-fired power stations, and as we've all seen, you know, now they're mining for lignite, which is the dirtiest fuel, right? It's the dirtiest coal, which is terrible. It's terrible for you know, the fact that they had clean power stations, nuclear power stations, and out of fear of a tsunami, you know, because of what happened in Fukushima, they shut them all down. But that, you know, I think in a way that had to happen, because it is a case study for the world now, where the people like me who used to say, well, nowhere's tried doing it, can now say, whoa, we tried. You can have 15 or 20% of wind and solar on your grid. You can. If it's hydro, obviously you can have a lot more, but for wind and solar, that's the limit. The rest needs to come from somewhere else. And you need to be honest about that's either going to be fossil fuel, it's always going to be nuclear, and you can't say it's neither. So that's where the technology's at. And I honestly don't believe that that problem will be solved by better technology. I think that technology is the best that we're going to get. And there are also drawbacks, obviously, in how much land they require. You know, nuclear requires a very small amount of land for the amount of energy it produces. But, you know, it's complicated. You know, if you're reusing land that's just, it's not used for anything, fine, but don't bulldoze trees to build, you know, to build solar farms. Some places are doing that. I think when the hyper focus becomes on just emissions, that's also a problem. We need to think about biodiversity as well and longevity of the resources. So you think, you know, a power plant's going to last at least 60 years, whereas the turbines and solar panels will need replacing in about 25. Nobody thinks about this or about the cost in turn by having to replace them. So there's a lot of different factors, but environmentally, nuclear is the cleanest, healthiest solution for the planet. And that's why I advocate for it. It's purely my reasoning.
So you're also interested in ethical parenting. What is that about, and how does it tie to environmentalism?
So, so initially when I started out with that, you know, and I wrote that book, it was because I'd become a parent, and the books that were on the market for green parents, people who cared about environmental issues, were full of nonsense, like full of pseudoscience. Honestly, like, don't vaccinate your kids at all. You know, don't drive. I mean, I don't drive, but there were a lot of things that these books argued for that were just impractical for most parents. Like, and actually, being a non-driver has had some significant challenges, but mostly they were just, you know. Also, I would say it's not always true. It's not always true that, you know, if you think about most people's daily lifestyles, we rely on a lot of different things, right? Like, we rely on being able to get from A to B. We have to do school runs. We have to choose how we feed our kids. And a lot of these books were just throwing rubbish out there saying, you know, here's the diet that you need to give your child, or you should have, here's the way you should eat, even just how you should give birth. A home birth is natural. Don't give, I mean, I know it probably sounds extreme to you, but this was what I was coming across again and again. And so I kind of put those books aside and said every single book that I looked at that time was saying these things. And I thought it was dangerous. And actually, by the way, I would love to know who's crunched the data to say that home birth is more environmentally friendly than, you know, than a hospital. I mean,
I also don't understand at all the bit about vaccination. What does that
why
have
do
to
they
do?
come right? So that's why I broaden it to, I'd say it's ethical parenting, but then they're saying it's unethical to give your baby an injection. And I would ask, well, are you saying that they should have no medicine at all? And actually, some of these books actually did say that. They said homeopathy, natural remedies. I mean, it's dangerous, honestly.
Oh my God.
Some of it is really dangerous, and you'd be surprised at how many people follow this advice because the books scare them. I read the books with a huge pinch of salt, like, this isn't true. They're saying that my baby will die if they have too much paracetamol. That's not true. I mean, you don't give babies paracetamol, but when they're older, Calpol or whatever, the branded version for kids. So what I did, what I did was decide someone needs to put out a sensible book that actually meets the concerns these people have of green or ethical parenting and maybe just define it a little bit. So I did actually look into things like the emissions caused by having a home birth versus, a hospital. But it's negligible, right? Because it's just too many different factors involved. But all right, people would say one's natural and the other, but then I would say, well, then you're saying it's natural for a lot of babies to die in childbirth. I mean, it's fine. It is fine to have a home birth, just put that out there. But what annoyed me was the amount of misinformation about it, but also kind of the pressure, from these groups and books, the pressure to do X because it's supposedly more ethical or moral, and more environmentally friendly somehow. So I went away and I crunched the numbers. And on some things, there was a lot of data. For example, nappies. There's data on cloth nappies versus regular nappies, but actually, there are still ways to use cloth nappies, like if you're regularly tumble drying them and things like that, that makes them less environmentally friendly than disposable. So I crunched all the data on that, and I there's a chapter on each thing, and even just traveling. The travel bit, I've kind of said, if you really want to give up your car, there are different ways you can. There are different kinds of bikes you can use for kids. Like I went real kind of detailed deep dive, but mainly the thing for me was to get people to think about those nuanced opinions rather than what they're being fed in these books, which I honestly think are quite dangerous. And at the time, there wasn't anything like it. That was the first kind of book of its kind. And actually, I had a discussion with my publisher about it because I wanted a chapter on vaccines, and they said, "Well, does that really fall under this?" And I said, "But the thing is, all the competing books do discuss vaccines, but it's all negative. It's saying there's so much mercury and autism and all this terrible stuff that isn't true, right? That vaccines do not cause autism. And even if they did, autism is not like, a disease that is so evil. Like some people are autistic. It's okay, Anyway, I really didn't like the way these books talked about those people. So I wrote it, and actually I had a huge backlash to that chapter about vaccinations. Huge. I had hate mail, people leaving me 1-star reviews just because of that chapter. I even had people saying, "Hey, I liked all the other chapters," because obviously they agreed with it, but not, "I don't like this." I had a little bit of pushback on the home birth, saying, "No, it definitely is better," and fine. Some people aren't going to change their minds, but I think it did provide something for other people like me who just genuinely, we just care about these issues, and we think, oh, well, I'll just get this book. It's in the library, or it's got good reviews in the Guardian. I'll read it because of that. And then they'd open it and they'd get lots of misinformation. And no, I think misinformation is a problem everywhere, but the main issue is when it's not countered, because then you just won't even see that it's misinformation. You have to be able to see counter arguments. Even if you then fall on this side of the argument, fine, you've made up your mind, but you have to be able to see it. So what I did was put that stuff out there at a time when no one was really doing it in those spaces. So yeah, that's, and now I would say now it's changed. My opinions of what it means to be an ethical parent have changed a lot. My kids are aware of climate change, but they're not anxious. They're not anxious kids. They don't have eco anxiety. They're not like the end of the world is happening. They're very aware of solutions, and they think around the problems. And I think actually we really need younger generations to be doing that, because they will inherit quite a lot of problems as they grow up, and we don't want them to just freeze and say we're doomed and give up. We want them to be really interested in the solutions. And I think that's actually, for me, that's the more ethical way of doing it. But ethics is a very broad term, and it means something different to everybody, and it's not data driven, but that book is 100% data driven. I mean, I read like 200 studies that are referenced in the back where I said, I have actually looked at these things that these other books are saying, and here's what the science says, and you can go away and make up your own mind. But yeah, mainly it was a response to the prevailing kind of consensus of books out there that I wrote that.
No, it really baffles me how so many environmentalists, activists particularly, use the label natural as if anything that's natural is good, when disease is natural, death is natural when it comes to birth. I mean, infant mortality is natural as well, mother mortality or female mortality. So, I mean, I just don't get it.
It's interesting though, because it really, I think, influences a lot of people who don't hold those beliefs in an extreme way, but they've heard it so much that that's why even a lot of people I'll speak to who don't know a lot about electricity or electricity generation, they will think, oh well, isn't wind and solar more natural? And I said, well, all of it requires mining and materials and a workforce, and people constructing it's not, you're not just getting energy from the sun. These are big pieces of infrastructure. And they say, oh, I hadn't really thought about that. But I always think it's interesting that they've assumed it's more natural. And I don't know why it would be more natural than, for example, splitting the atom. It's really just an ideology that's seeped into quite a lot of people's thinking until it's challenged. Again, that misinformation just lives in there kind of rent free. And then when it's challenged, a lot of people will say, oh, well, yeah, I didn't think of that. But it's amazing to me how far that natural terminology has gone. But same with GMOs, right? It's another thing I talk about. People say, oh, well, they're not natural. And I said, well, why? Oh, don't they cause XYZ problems? Well, no, you have food on your plate because we have gene editing, we should be thankful for this. This is a good thing. But again, that these fearful stories and ideas of what's natural versus what isn't have really seeped into people's brains. But actually, if you look around you, nothing is natural. Nothing. Not even landscapes. Not even the hillsides, and that we've engineered our entire environment, right? If we're really honest about it, and that's okay, because that's if we do it, surely it is natural. We're part of nature. That's the arguments I make. But you have to do a lot of thinking to get there, I think. And a lot of people just land on this old idea of. In fact, I saw something recently which I thought was interesting, which is a YouGov poll. That's like a independent data survey here in the UK, and it asked people if they thought, previous generation life was better for previous generations. A lot of them said, no, to be fair, so like 70%, no, life is better now. But you'd be surprised the chunk of people that said life was better in the 17th century and the 18th century. You'd be surprised, and I've known those people, so I believe it. But I could see a lot of people in the comments on this data. It's like, who believes that? You'd be surprised. A lot of these really hardcore environmentalists or activists, that is really what they believe. It's not a myth to say they think we should go back to living on the land in poverty. They really think that's better for the planet and not for people, but for the planet.
Yeah, maybe they should go back to hunter-gathering, because agriculture is also not natural.
Yeah, well, some of them, I mean, again, I've known the more extreme wing, but some of them do, so I know someone in London who was the spokesperson of Extinction Rebellion, who is not on the grid. He has solar panels. When they run out, he just lives without. He doesn't use a flush toilet. He uses his garden, and he has a compost loo, and he doesn't have a fridge. So, because he lives with intimate. So his view is everyone could live like this because I live like this. My view visiting there was nobody wants to live like this. Like, I have relatives in India living in poverty who are forced to live like this, who do not want to live like this. But also, it's a very high maintenance lifestyle. This idea that it's like slow and natural and lovely is not. Like, he's having to do a lot of work and a lot of mental labor, I would say, to, if he buys butter, how long is it going to last for without a fridge? When can he cook it? He can only cook it when there's enough solar generation. So he's going by the weather. And fine, that's his lifestyle. But he lives a very middle-class lifestyle. He's able to do that because he doesn't, he's paid off his house and he doesn't have a job and he doesn't have children. That's not most people. Most of us cannot live like that, So yeah, it's this real bubble of, and I would say they are very privileged, kind of wealthy people who are doing it. So we can do it. Everyone can do it. I can tell you a funny story. Years ago, I got invited to go see these hippies out at this place called Stewartswood. So there's a national park here where I live, called Dartmoor National Park, and they'd set up camp there. And the council wanted to evict them because it's illegal to live there. And they said, well, we're squatting the land, we're living on the land, and there was a legal case. And I was in with the hippies, so all the hippies say it's outrageous. They shouldn't kick them off. They're living sustainably. So I thought, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to write an article. I'm going to help the cause. So I went down there to write an article and help the cause. I was absolutely heartbroken because they were not living off the land. They were getting huge grocery deliveries from Tesco, from Sainsbury's, huge deliveries that they'd have to pay for extra petrol because they had to come so far out to the middle of nowhere. They had a few chickens. They had a few eggs from, local. They were growing a few vegetables. Very little though, very little of it. Fine, they were using water from a nearby river. Okay, fine. So they weren't connected. They weren't connected to the grid at all. So they were doing little bits and pieces, but I would say their carbon footprint was way higher than anyone living in a city. I mean, while I was there interviewing one of them, this guy's name was Merlin, right? I was interviewing him. What's the lifestyle like? Why should you be allowed to stay here? He said he had to answer the phone. He said his mum was here. So I went out to have a look, and his mum had come to pick up his laundry, to take it home and wash it in a washing machine and dry it in a tumble dryer. I'm not exaggerating. This is a true story. And bring it back. And she had to drive from the city. So it's a 40-minute drive each way. She's washing and tumble drying it because they didn't have a way to wash clothes.
Oh my
They didn't
God.
want to spend all day washing clothes and then drying damp clothes indoors. I mean, it's very wet here, so you'll be lucky if you can dry them outdoors. And every few days she'd do this. So they all had this. This whole community was relying on ordinary civilization, but claiming, oh, we're off grid and we don't need any of that. So as soon as I saw it was a lie, I didn't write about it at all. And I was nice enough not to go away and write a horrible piece about it. But that's what I saw from that community. And I think, it's a lie really, isn't it? Even the people that have the means and the energy and time to do it, they're not able to do it. And they were eventually evicted simply because they were told if they could show that they were living, sustainably within certain parameters, they actually might be able to stay. And they couldn't meet those parameters because they couldn't sustain a lifestyle themselves. They couldn't provide enough food for themselves. They couldn't. So, and who was picking up their waste? The council was having to pick up their waste. So when you live in ordinary society, you have to pay, right? In my tax money, it comes out, they pick up my recycling and my waste. Well, they were basically refusing to do that because they were living on the land saying we're sustainable, but it was just piling up, so the council had to pick it up. So there were a lot of problems there. We kind of go, if only there was a solution to this. It's called living in this city where I live. All of these problems are solved, and my carbon footprint is much lower because, it's just much lower. Yeah, anyway, many different reasons, but especially the food, and actually I get some of my vegetables I get from a local farm, which is fairly sustainable because they drop them off to a farmer's market, which they do every week anyway. Lots of people pick up the food there, and that, in a small way, I do that. I think it's better. I'm supporting the local farmer. I know the guy, he's a great guy, but that's not going to feed everyone. I'm not under an illusion that just because I got a little bit there, it's going to feed everyone. In the same way, we can't be in an illusion just because it's really windy today and we have lots of wind power. That's going to be every day forever. The amount of journalists that were saying that was shocking to me because they were saying, this is the future. And I was like, what do you know about the future that it's going to be windy every day? Do you know that about the future? What they were saying was, if we build more, we'll get more. But that's not how it works, right? Because we're not controlling the weather. I know you understand that, but these quite high-fly journalists didn't understand it. So I had a few conversations with people about it, but that's where, the nuance of the conversation needs to happen, and it's not happening. And I really think we need to move forward into that bit, because you can't implement solutions if you're still stuck on myths, essentially believing myths.
So just to wrap up our conversation, let me ask you one final question. So when it comes to climate change and the ways we can tackle it, of course, we talked here a lot about technological solutions, but of course, there would be other kinds of systemic solutions through politics, regulations, and all of that. But another set of solutions that we've also touched on, and many of the activists focus the most on, occur at an individual level, like changing some of our habits and all of that. But I mean, that's all great, and it's great when people do that. But at the same time, sometimes it seems that activists tend to be a little bit more realistic when it comes to, oh, you should do this, you should stop doing that, and so on. And they think that we can solve most of the issue if people just stop, I don't know, driving or using or started using EVs or taking shorter showers or something like that. So how do you balance perhaps, or what do you think is most important here? I mean, what we can do at an individual level or on a systemic level?
So, I mean, on an individual level, I don't think it makes that much difference. Most of these
Mhm,
things just don't. I mean, yeah, all right, switch to an EV, drive a bit less, get a bike, fine. They're still really small amounts. And I know what people say, if everybody does it, it's more. Again, they're doing that in Germany. They still need a lot of electricity and they're still having to use coal to power that. So we have a case study. I'm not saying we shouldn't do these common sense things. And some things are
mhm,
more um some things are more obvious than others. So one thing that we don't talk about enough, I think, is insulating houses. So in the
mhm,
UK, we have really terrible insulation. The homeowner has to pay for it. So there's no real incentive. But a lot of houses are drafty, and cost a lot of money. Now, all right, fine, if the homeowner can put up money, they will do it because it will save them money in the long run because they have less damp and they use less electricity. But actually, a lot of people are landlords. A lot of people are renting from landlords and the landlords have no incentive to do it. So I think there's some things like that really simple, which they have done well in Germany, to incentivize or provide money for, or loans for people to be able to do that. It's a really
yeah,
obvious thing because we are just leaking heat. We're wasting heat, in quite a dominantly cold country. I know it's not as cold as other countries, but it feels like it's very cold here all the time. And we do have very drafty damp houses, so that's a simple thing. Um, there is a move towards electrification that does need to happen. And again, I know a
mhm,
lot of people don't like the idea, but it just does need to happen. It's common sense. We need to electrify everything. And then we need to have clean electricity grid. That's a big chunk. It's not all of the problem, it's a
mhm,
big chunk of the problem. But in terms of
yeah,
individual actions, honestly, I would say talking about the solutions is really important. And fighting for solutions is really important because historically we've always had people that fight on the basis of problems. That's what activists do, right? You find the problem and you focus on the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. And that what you need is the instigators and the change makers who actually care about the evidence, care about the scientific solutions to push those forwards. And you have got people doing it, some really important people like James Hansen, the grandfather of climate change, as people like to call him. He's a big advocate for nuclear now. And one of the things he says is that to young people, his message to young people, the most important thing you do is work in the nuclear industry. That's what he said. Which, yeah, okay. We need engineers and builders. My thoughts and wishes are not going to solve today's problems. It is the engineers and the builders that are going to do it. Politicians can make sure those things are implemented and that we can use that as a pressure point. So in terms of individual action, we should have those conversations with politicians. I'm not saying
mhm,
send your MP hate mail. I'm saying have conversations because a lot of them, actually, when I started talking about nuclear, I reached out to a lot of them here, journalists, editors, politicians. And actually, a lot of them said privately they already agreed. And I said, well, why don't you write or talk about it? Oh, the public doesn't want to. So, okay, I'm going to go and commission some data here and find out what the public wants. Okay, it's come back and it said, actually, they really support this. Will you talk about it now? And then they started to, but they only know what the public thinks about. Often they don't look, they're not even looking at data points, right? They're not scientifically literate people. They're just looking at their
mhm,
emails. And when they open their emails, they get 50 people saying, I hate the fact that you're putting in an EV pump in my area. They think nobody wants this. We shouldn't do this. We should, that really is how that's just, that's one of the flaws of democracy. That's just how it works.
yeah,
It's people powered, but it's all the negatives. So we really need people to send in those emails and say, actually, I think this is a really good idea that you have a low traffic neighborhood, for example, or that you're putting in the EV pumps, or, what measures are you taking, practical measures, and do you support clean energy? Even if it's not in your region, it's important that people are talking about it and know what solutions are. And I speak to some quite high level individuals who don't know. And they'll literally hop on a call and they'll say, can you explain to me why we need nuclear? I mean, that's where we're starting. What's wrong with coal? All right, okay. Um, you'd be surprised. I'm not talking about ordinary lay people. I'm talking about people in high positions of power. So those
Yeah.
conversations are so important. And it also, so my answer to your question is talk about solutions, because also there is so much hyper focus on the negatives and the problems, and that's still really prevalent. And then when you do hear solutions like, hey, we're excited because it's so windy today, they're false. They're false solutions because it's simplified. It makes a good story or a good slogan. Well, the solutions aren't actually good stories and slogans. They're really quite complicated. So we need people who talk about the nuance and the data and talk about it to key figures like their local representatives, use a democratic process, or get involved, go to meetings and have a voice, and speak to different audiences, speak to people who maybe aren't that interested in electricity, but they care about climate change, because that's not being added up. They just think, well, I use my bike today, so it's fine. Well, actually, the systemic problems are far bigger, much bigger. And if we implement big solutions, then that's going to have way more of an impact than, putting on one less wash cycle a week. That's just the truth, isn't it? You can still put on one less wash cycle a week if you want to, but all of us doing it isn't going to make a dent, right? On the emissions. It's just not going to make a dent. What's going to make a dent is building lots of clean energy. That's it. And then electrifying as much as we can so we can get off the remaining fossil fuels. It's not a complicated message, but it's still a message that needs to be put out there, because I think it's still not countering that apocalyptic doom narrative enough.
Great. So let's end on that message then. And where can people find you on the internet?
I have a website, seeonlights.co.uk, but also I have a Substack if you look for Everything is Light. All of these issues are covered. I've done a really long piece on waste. I've done a piece on the need for gas in lower income countries, things like that. And they're heavily referenced. So, you don't have to take my word for it on these calls. I always say anything that I say in any podcast interview, you can go and have a look at the article and you can click the links and it will take you to the source and you can look at the data. And I urge people to do that, because I think a lot of people get they feel like, oh, with science it's too complicated, it's not for me. And I said that's not true. Anyone can understand some of these really basic concepts. You just need to know where to look and to understand the difference between some blog post that says solar, the sun is causing climate change and the sun will fix it, whatever arguments people are making, and actually look at our world in data or the IPCC or any the UN data or anywhere that puts out really good numbers, and good summaries of those for the people that aren't so mathematically inclined as well. But yeah, I would urge people to have a look.
Great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description of the interview. And Zion, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really, really fun to talk with you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Errington, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.